Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. Your introduction is almost as long as my talk. What I plan to do is talk for a modest amount of time. I really would like to open it up for questions and comments, preferably questions. I find that this audience is different than quite often the audiences I address, which quite often are technologists only, and I'd like to see the input from that. I should comment very briefly on the Cyber Civilization Research Center at Keio. Basically, the aim here is to look at the impact of cyber in all its aspects on civilization as a whole. If you look historically, every time we've changed communication, the interaction with nation states, the interaction of economy has changed. When the first undersea telegraph cable went in, suddenly Europe and the United States were able to talk in milliseconds as opposed to 10 days. That improved a lot of things and it caused a lot of problems. Every time we do that, we've changed, we've created stresses, we create advantages. It's clear that the internet did that in spades. That plus some other issues, which I'll maybe get into later. So, if I can get this thing to work. Okay. Did I miss one? No, okay. Let me first start out by pleading that you understand that we don't do AI. Okay. AI is an old subject. It's been going on since I was at Bell Labs. I had the privilege back then of working with or for the leaders and the inventors of AI, Al Perlis, Al Newell, just real leaders in that field. They were trying to make an environment where machines could behave as humans in the sense of thinking, being able to come up with the type of leap forwards that we seem to be able to do in our mind. It was very difficult to do that work. It's still difficult. I noted with interest that Science magazine, the journal of the AAAS, published an article a couple of weeks ago which said maybe we could look at the way the brain operates in order to understand better how a real AI system would operate. That article was essentially the same as the one I read 10 years ago and 20 years ago. We have not made good progress there, mainly because we don't understand how the brain operates. We don't have ways of monitoring it. We don't have ways of inspecting what it's doing. Very coarse stuff. Functional MRI just does not give us enough detail. So we don't do AI. We do deep learning. We look at massive amounts of data, a massive amount of experience, and we draw inferences from it. Now, I'm not saying that's not valuable. It's incredibly valuable. It's just not AI. And so images of iRobot or Asimov's robotics or Terminator are just not within our grasp. Not with autonomous control in the sense that they control it. There are controllable robots which may cause us problems, but it's not AI. And I bear down on that mainly to make sure that you understand that we're doing a spectacular amount of stuff in a very constrained area. We just have no idea in the world of how to do intelligent machines. Okay, why has that happened? Deep learning as a field, I'll call it neural nets because that's how it's usually done, where you have this environment where as you feed in data, relationships are made and inferences can be drawn from it. Were first explored in the 60s. Bell Labs was one of the leaders in that, MIT was others. We didn't have the computing power back then. We could make toy applications. What's happened over the past 50 years now is our computing power has gotten incredibly advanced. Now, I keep pointing out that My watch, my Apple Watch, has more computing power than Bell Labs had when it was leaders in computing, undisputed leaders. So now we can operate on very large environments. We can put them together in distributed environments, the cloud. I tend to hate that term, but and we have a huge amount of data on which to learn, because this whole thing depends on your abilities to learn from the past, learn from data. When you play chess, for instance, one of the things you do is look at all the moves that have been done by masters, and you try to draw from that inferences on what you should do. I'm simplifying it, a lot of things, but that's basically the role. We've advanced from a nice computer science toy, which it was back then, to an economic force. Everybody is doing deep learning. I may lapse into calling it AI, but please excuse me. Some people have called it light AI. I find that difficult to swallow in the sense of terms. It's being applied to a huge amount of fields, from medicine through hiring decisions, policing, looking at your behavior and decide whether or not you will be potentially a thief or create a crime. China, for instance, with their social credit system, is using that methodology to grade people, to decide whether or not they should be allowed to travel, etc. There's good parts to that, and there are very bad parts to it. Side thing here, China does it as a government action. We do it as a commercial action, in the sense that we're using equivalent methodology for looking at your credit scores, your ability to get loans, hiring, etc. No country, no society is free of trying to use this both for good and bad. So, we tend to say they're bad, we're good. Basically, we're trying to learn how to do it. So it's not AI. I want to push that across very hard. Okay. I'm going to spend a lot of time saying what our problems are, because I think it's very important that we understand what the problems are. Okay. It's used often as if it's a perfect tool, that you look at this massive amount of data, you look at experiences, etc., and you draw a conclusion. And as with most computing stuff, your automatic assumption is that what comes out is correct. That's not necessarily true with deep learning systems. The quality of what comes out depends on what goes in. The quality of what comes out depends on who decided the rules, who built the neural nets underneath it. Now, we're beginning slowly but surely to learn how to let neural nets adapt themselves a little bit. But that's very, very current stuff, and it's not clear that it works. But that means that, in fact, we will make mistakes. And those mistakes can have deep impacts. It can have impacts on the person who is denied insurance, for instance, because of some deep, I'll call it AI system, it's easier to say, which decided based on the things it knows about you that you're not a good credit risk, or you're not a good health risk. And the more data you have on a person, in some sense, the more you can make these predictions, but they very critically depend on the models and the assumptions that are built in. So programmers are still there, data scientists, whatever that means, are still there. We don't train people very well in that area at all. Usually it's computer scientists who decide what the rule structure is. That's a dangerous game with computer sciences are not trained to do that type of work. We can train them, but the quality may be missing. So that it's, and worse yet, it is very difficult to understand if a model, a deep learning model, will produce always correct results. It may produce erroneous mistakes. Our programs in general, operating systems, everything, occasionally makes mistakes. You get a crash, you get a bad answer. That's happened in the history of computing for years. Here, the incorrect mistake may be one that sends a person to jail, or at least endangers their health. We don't understand how to monitor these things, and as they grow more and more complex, our abilities to understand whether they're correct or not is even hard to talk about. And yet they are getting bigger. The ability of us to now tie together different AI systems, different learning systems, and couple them means that now, courtesy of our worldwide networks and our computing clouds, we can now have enormous interacting systems. And again, we don't really know exactly how good they are, best way of putting it. It can yield unexpected and possibly wrong results and possibly dangerous results. Now, some of it is an issue of, let me call it ethics. Cars are an interesting case. Our automated cars, assuming they work, have some interesting problems which are constantly raised in courses that look at ethics. Suppose the car's driving down the road and there's a broken down car in front of them, and on the sides of that broken down car there are two groups of people. One an elderly woman or man, and the other some kids. Which way should the car go? It can't stop. Which way should it go? That's not something that a computer will, it's not a computational problem. Built into that is some deep ethical considerations which are not worldwide. I can tell you, most likely in parts of Asia, with the respect for the elderly, they may choose the elderly side. In other places, they'll choose the children on the grounds that they're the best future payoff. I've used that term badly. How is that decided? I have no idea in the world. It certainly shouldn't be decided by a couple of computer science people hacking up some neural nets. So that's a big question, and it's a very difficult question. And it just shows up all over the place. Airplanes, well, we saw one example, which is probably not particularly a problem of deep learning, but it shows the impact of automatic systems and human beings. We couldn't fly our planes currently if we didn't have a huge amount of automation. Pilots have reasonable focus times, and to expect it for over a 20-hour period for them to do things right if they don't have a lot of automation is unreasonable. On the other hand, complex automation can get ahead of the pilot. Witness the two crashes there. Now that also had a lot of non-automated problems. I flew a plane for a long time as a pilot, and the thought of having a plane that counted on one sensor to make a decision that critical is unheard of in the aviation industry. And that's a big problem. But that has nothing to do with the technology. It has more to do with decision making. Hiring is another one that can just go wrong. If you look at the social credit system in China, all your activities, allegedly, are gathered together and a quote score is made. And depending on the level of your score, you may or may not be able to take a train. You may not be able to be hired. We do roughly the same. There are a lot of now human resource people who feed the information about a potential hire into a computer system, and that computer system gives them advice on whether or not this person should be hireable. Now, some of it depends on health records, and so the massive amount of information we gather on people has a big impact on that. If you have a lot of claims or a lot of hospitalization, you may not be able to get the job because you're a potential liability for health insurance costs. Now, we've done that for years, but not as carefully and cleanly as we do it now. And this is beginning, I think, to happen going down in age, behavior of kids in school, behavior of them on their social networks, are going to have an impact on whether or not they're admitted to schools potentially, whether or not they're hired, whether or not they get security clearance if they're in that line of work. And yet it all comes from a not very well controlled gathering of information about the person, and one that in general is not approved by the person. And then there's my favorite one, which is the tendency of law enforcement to say, AI, we're going to use that to make sure that we identify people who are going to be criminals and do something about it. It's never quite clear what they intend to do about it. But in general, you could see a world where in the future those people are educated, I think that's a nice term, to make sure that they don't damage society. That would be, I don't think it's acceptable under any situation, but it's certainly not acceptable when you don't know that those evaluations are correct. So where does that leave us? Two things. One is we don't have an ethical base for people who develop these systems. And we don't have an environment where the commercialization of them can be controlled. Facebook, Google, all those places make their money basically on being able to either forecast your desires, Amazon is a good one, for goods or other things that can feed into stuff which makes money. Okay? Some of the pharmacies have access to your hospital data and your medical records and will attempt to use that to enhance their abilities to sell to you. There was one particular case which I found interesting where looking at the behavior of a female group of people, they try to deduce who's becoming pregnant, and therefore bombarding them with sales material on goods for babies, etc. Before, in fact, often before the person even knows they're pregnant if they are. Is that acceptable? I don't think so. That type of penetration of the commercial sector into the very intimate details of how you live, what your life is, I think are very, very dangerous. Now, let me assure you that if you talk to at least a lot of people in industry, they think it's a grand idea. But they're in business to make money. We're still in an era where the prime obligation of business often is to produce stockholder value. On the other hand, I'm not excusing it, but I point out that people, when they use things like Google services, are getting a free good, and they're paying for it by having all their information gathered, analyzed, and stored forever. Now, allegedly, by the way, Google offers a service to universities for a fee, which guarantees that they will not do that. Can you be sure they don't do it? I have no idea in the world. If you go and ask the companies what they do, often they'll give you a song and dance, and you're never quite sure what it is. The danger here is not just our commercial world. The other day at Stevens, I held the first of a set of conversations, I call them, that Keio is going to do, where two of us get together. I'll be the moderator for a while, and sit down on the stage and discuss a topic of shared interest and broadcast it. This one was on cyber war versus nuclear war / nuclear war versus cyber war. And it turned out, by the audience reaction, to be a very, very interesting discussion. I found it interesting as one of the players. But I bring that up because, in fact, more and more decisions on what we do are going to be heavily determined, heavily directed by systems which analyze the environment, computer deep learning systems, which analyze the environment and tell decision makers what they should do. Do you, how many remember war games? Yeah, we're there. You know, we may not have machines that's quite as intelligent, but when you're looking at reaction times that quite often happen, you automatically go to deep learning systems which say, under this environment, we recommend you do that. Now, that doesn't mean that they fire the buttons, but in fact, with the time scales we're talking about, that will probably force it. That's a dangerous game, very dangerous game. The other thing which I worry a lot about, and that's our reaction to things. We live in a world that's largely controlled by computers. Our power system that distributes electricity is very heavily controlled by computer systems. I was married the night of the first blackout, and I have fond memories of it and not so fond memories of it. I was at 43rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenue when the lights went out. Look at what could happen now if the lights go out. Probably the first thing we do is to blame North Korea or China. Take your choice, okay? What the political system would do under those conditions is largely unpredictable right now, because it will be emotional, it will be political, it will be, you know, gut feeling of what they should do. That's a very dangerous game when they're going to count on advice from computer systems which look at the state of the world and the state of things and try to draw emphasis and recommendations. That doesn't mean we should not do it. It just means that we have to realize that we're not getting, it's not a numeric solution. When I add 5 and 5 together, I get 10. Okay, and most computer systems will give me 10. When I take a set of facts and a set of past experience and I put it together, I might not get 10. I may get 8 or 12. And so you may react in exactly the wrong way. And that can escalate quite rapidly up to activity, up to an environment which we prefer not to see happen. So what I'm saying is caution. We're there. We're not going to bury this stuff. But we should be looking at citizens not particularly as to whether we'll have intelligent robots going around the iRobot thing, because that's way in the future. I don't think we have the vaguest idea how to do that. But we should be looking at the use of deep learning systems to make critical decisions about us, about our world, and about the future of the world. And we're not really doing that. There have been several attempts to define an ethical basis. Now, one should watch ethical bases. We've had in the engineering profession, the ACM has a statement, Association for Computing Machinery, has a set of ethical recommendations for computer scientists. I would guess that maybe 1% of computer scientists know it exists. We don't educate them. We don't have any ethics courses in our educational system. It's not it may be required by the accrediting agencies, but it's so small that it's usually waved over. And yet, those people are the ones who, in fact, are going to implement these things, and they should have knowledge. Witness Google, when they were building a search engine for the Chinese, allegedly, for the Chinese. It's not allegedly, they were doing it, they admitted to that. A lot of the technical people reacted, okay? But that went pretty far before they reacted, and the people involved in it were not particularly sensitive. They just did what they were told. You know, and the argument is, unfortunately, very much like the Nuremberg things. You know, I was just told to do it. I work here, I don't think. There are two of them. They tend to be very hard to draw up ethics, because on one hand, Oren's ethical statements, Oren is chief executive officer officer of the Allen Institute for AI. By the way, he gets up on the stage and says, we don't do AI. We do deep learning, which I think is interesting because the name. But here's a set of things which are largely designed for the practitioners in the field. And you can sort of, I'm not going to go through them, but most of these turn out to be very difficult to actually implement. You know, the fact that they put a set of requirements on the implementers that are counterproductive for their careers means that unless it's really a bad thing, they're not going to react. So that's one issue. I'm not going to try to read it. This was another one, which is Brussels Agreement. This came out of a group of largely not-for-profit groups like EFF and others got together for this. And this sounds very good, but I can't see a company paying any attention to it because it puts limits. You know, they shouldn't maintain a secret profiling system. Yeah, I mean, that's nice to say. Will you stop Facebook from doing that? Not unless there are laws in place. The UN has another set, and there are several others going around. They have to be somehow merged, and they have to be merged in a way that we're not used to merging things, in the sense that we need to understand that if this is to be effective, it has to be followed internationally. Two things wrong there. I mean, most countries have their own view on this, and they're impacted by their corporate and their own philosophy. The other thing is that if we ever had a treaty, I could almost guarantee the US would not sign it, which is a big problem. We haven't tended to sign. There's another place this comes up. There's a lot of motion now to declare that certain activities like attacking the critical infrastructure of a country, be it financial or power or whatever, should be the equivalent of Geneva Conventions. I guess it's Geneva, the gas, poison gases. It should be forbidden except in time of war and a few other things. There's a lot of interest in doing that, and you can almost bet there'll be a lot of countries who refuse to sign it. So how do you deal with this, where more and more the technology is endangering the world? Notice, by the way, that the bulletin of the atomic scientist clock is slowly going towards midnight. That's due to two reasons, both of which are largely instigated by cyber, but not completely. We're beginning to get to a point, and this is a little off topic, but again, it's an ethical discussion that has to be carried on now, not after the fact. We may not be here after the fact, but anyway. Up until now, the use of atomic weapons has been not done. People are scared to do it. It's sort of something you don't do after the back off after the Cold War. Now people are beginning to say, well, can't we use a small nuclear device, for instance, to get rid of a deep bunker? You know, we have precision-guided missiles, we'll send over with a nuclear device, limited damage, etc. Those things very seldom don't escalate. You hit me with one, I'll hit you with one slightly larger, and away we go. Very difficult, and again, it's often motivated or underpinning. There's computer systems which are advising you on long-term strategy. Government does not have one, believe me. These are all there. I think I'm going to, am I about right? Yeah, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but what I'm trying to do is to sensitize this audience to the fact that there's a very, very valuable resource there, a computational resource. It has all the power that we've gotten out of computers. You know, computers control almost everything we do. In general, they do a fairly good job, not necessarily. In the deep learning, they can be very dangerous. I'll throw one more thing in. How many of you believe that your computer systems are reasonably secure? No, good. They're not. I point out to people that when you buy a virus system for money, what usually that will protect you against is high school kids. It will not protect you against any serious person. Our computer systems, our internet, our whole thing have a lot of very difficult to fix security problems. That reflects back on when I have to do decision making based on deep learning, distributed deep learning, I have to worry about whether the security of those systems has been violated. We don't know how to do that. So a whole bunch of interesting problems that for the students in here, I leave to you to solve. I created part of the problem. One final thing, you've all heard of quantum computing. If it happens, and I think they're fairly confident that we can do something, but that could make deep learning even more deep. That could actually make it much more sophisticated. That doesn't necessarily mean it will make it more accurate, but it will be able to handle much larger databases, much larger neural nets in real time. So we're in for a very interesting time. I commend to teachers here that it's worse than bad not to bring up ethical issues. Kids will learn, maybe it will help them in the future. If we don't do it, we're going to have some serious problems on our hands. I open to questions.
Can I have this thing? Yeah.
Is this microphone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we have name?
Yeah, my name is Tom Tauber. Good morning. I'm struck that the guidelines that you put up, which I had not seen before, which is very interesting, don't start out with the statement of the Hippocratic Oath, which says, first, do no harm. And it appears that they concern themselves mostly with transparency, as opposed to the issue, at what point will the system get out of control, that is to say, out of human control. It seems to me that these statements here all imply that humans will have full control over the system, and this says nothing about what happens if the system takes over and does things that are beyond the control of humans.
Yeah,
Would you address that, please?
That's very accurate. Can you hear me? This is what? Okay. There's been some current research in deep learning systems that evolve, not create intelligence. Just get that off. But based on what it's done and the scope of what it examines, decides that it will modify its neural net, will modify its criteria. That doesn't necessarily always work positively. Okay? But you also raised another interesting question. One of the places where neural nets have had a fair amount of, quote, success is in the medical area. We have huge medical databases, lots of sensitivity on their analysis, lots of laws, but in fact, there's a huge amount of data there. The one I liked was that, I forget who did it, but I think it was Google actually, they came up with this brilliant idea that they would be able to use deep learning and their basically social networks to predict when flu epidemics were starting. And so they looked at all the stuff they have available to use about, looking for words that talked about flu, et cetera. And they predicted some epidemics. Well, it turned out what was happening is when a neighbor got a flu, the relatives and the neighbors would talk about the fact that they have flu and the ... and that would score up as a mini epidemic in that area when one person had the flu. And predictions were so off that At that point, Google quietly stuck out the back door. So, yeah, you're right. I didn't claim any of these are good. I just illustrated for the attitude of it. Yes, they do sort of say, do no harm. They leave that out. But remember, Google's motto used to be, do no harm, do no harm, do no evil. Notice that's not used anymore. That could be accidental, but I doubt it. I expect to hear some questions from students.
So from what you said, it seems like private industry really isn't going to regulate itself. Does that mean the only real solution in America is going to be voting?
No. Our abilities to regulate are very bad track record. Now, I spent some time along with Jerry Faulhaber, who's here at the FCC, and we can attest to the fact that regulation has its problems. It's heavily influenced by industry, by lobbyists, by a whole set of things, and by a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of government officials on the technology that underpins whatever they're regulating. And when I was at the FCC, I think there were a small handful of people who understood what the internet was, even though they were somehow trying to see how to regulate it. Government, I think, is a bad place to regulate in the sense that it hasn't done a good job. It's politically sensitive. It's just not, I'm not sure how to regulate. And part of it is in the ethics when people do things. And I guess, I'm not a lawyer, but I guess getting companies to be liable for what they do, as opposed to now where it's very hazy on the liability. If I predict something or I say something about your employment possibilities, am I liable? God knows. I don't know how to control it. Ideally, and also remember that these things are not national. I think you see in the European right to be forgotten the problem of internationalizing in local areas laws or rulings. It's just very difficult to do. So I just don't know. I think that's an interesting question for international lawyers, international philosophers of law. I don't see that many people addressing it, but there are people trying to address it.
So if we were going to try to improve the situation, do you have any recommendations for, like, what would we actually do?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in the fact that we need to educate our people more. We produce the next generation of people. We have to educate them. Whether it will stick or not, I don't know. At some point in the future, though, I think we're going to be in the potential of having society saying, why did you allow that to happen? And we may not want to be in that position as scientists. The last time we did that, we didn't actually follow through. The nuclear physicists lived in a very depressing world after nuclear bombs. They realized what they had done and wanted to argue whether they did was right or wrong, but in fact it was a deep philosophical problem, which we still I think education is the best thing. I would like to see a requirement in the computer science program for a course in ethics, practical ethics, not philosophical, if I can use that term, but practical ethics, looking at case law, case studies, to see what could have been done, what wasn't. Because I found it impossible to actually, even at good schools, any schools, get that course approved. You have so much to teach in computer science undergraduate that that's not really it. So we also have to change the attitude of the teachers.
Mr. Farber, if you could stand at the podium, we can't, oh, there we go.
Okay, I'm
Never
sorry.
mind.
I'm a uncontrollable wanderer.
Good morning. This is Saeed Ismaili. First of all, as a teacher in computer science, I really appreciate the talk. I am personally enjoying this conversation. I definitely take into account the education. I think that is a great thing that we all have to remember. But even if without, not just for graduate or undergraduate studies, I think that disjunction between the social sciences or the liberal arts and the science in terms of hardcore science that we have, that is also a deeper problem that I don't know how we can address it or in a graduate or undergraduate level. We can definitely add more courses, but I think the disjunction between the liberal arts and the historic and the old school science as math, physics, and this is also even worse in other countries. In the US, I guess, going through different education systems, I believe here we at least have a better understanding of social sciences as opposed to, let's say, South Korea, Russia, India, even China. They do have a complete separation between, for example, social liberal arts and the sciences. And all of these things that or of efforts that we see, for example, in Facebook, they do have a team of engineers doing all their work, and then they do have a team of, let's say, ethical people who are working on the ethics after the fact that the product has been designed. So what are your concerns or what will be your recommendations to address if this is a problem and how we can basically address
a
this?
problem. By the way, Google just disbanded their group, the advisory group, for, I thought, bad reasons. People objected to one person on it. Advisory groups are useless unless you have a spread of people. If all the people agree to it, when they come to it, you don't have an advisory board. You have a mouthpiece that just says the same thing. But politically, they have problems. I think I would point out two things. Rosemont is attempting to do that in the sense of infusing a modest amount of technology into what's largely a liberal arts education. Right? That's one very important thing to do, because practically, though, if you look at who's going to be in the legislature and the endless government agencies around the world, it's likely not to be people who come out of certainly a computer science education. There are a few, but they're relatively rare. Okay? They make money and they go elsewhere. So infusing into making sure that your people who are going to go to law school, et cetera, have some appreciation of the technology of the world they're going to live in and do live in is important. The reverse problem is severe. In the technological world, and part of this is cultural, there's very little respect for social science. It's not hard. It's not hard science. And I think that's wrong. Part of it is the way they publish. I'll admit to having a slight bias there. Most social science papers quote what he said about what he said about what he said about what he said, and then at the end, you say something. Right? That's not the way engineering and science works. Unfortunately, we go to the other extreme. We never bother to say what happened before, but the two are incompatible in passing information. And I think part of one part that could be useful, again, is to have part of a science education, at least a section that talks about social science issues. If you want to see the disconnect there, National Science Foundation has a social science activity which is constantly under attack. It's been that way for years. That quote, that's not science. Somebody once pointed out that, I do say this with much fear, that any discipline that has the term science in it is probably not science. I think that's unfair, but that's the perception. And I think we need to cross-pollinate. And I read a fair amount of social. I live in an environment in Tokyo where social science is fairly active. I'm trying to understand it because it's social science in the Japanese mode, which is head-splitting at times, but valuable. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Oh.
Yeah, I recently have a article in the Health Affairs blog on the psychological danger of violent video games, and I'm one of the things I mentioned is there was a Supreme Court ruling on a law in California that had been passed that said they couldn't be sold to children without permission, and the law was struck down as unconstitutional by a 7-2 majority. So that sort of shows the limitation. I mean, even if you have an ethical principle on this, it's not likely to ever have the force of law. So how are we going to get ahead if you can't even in the United States pass a simple law like that?
Not a lawyer. I think the way we've been not successful but better than is the organizations outside of EFF, EPIC, etc., ACLU, which sort of try to put the fire to the souls of government and law. That's not always a very productive way of doing it. Educating the public might be a good way to do it because they keep electing people that don't care.
Yeah, I did suggest that cooperation of, for example, the American Psychological Association with the educational societies might in fact be able to do that.
They may be able to. I think one of the problems I see is that these groups hardly ever get together and talk.
Yeah, that's true.
And I've been trying for a long time to change that, but with some lack of success because they do compete for funding.
Yeah.
And so they keep worrying about, well, maybe if we meet together, we'll lose some money.
Yeah.
I think that's nonsense.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. In this list here in your presentation, you said there were two problems with it. One example you gave was regarding nuclear weapons. Did you get to the second one, or did I miss it?
No, that's the problem I have with this set is that it is, I think, not acceptable to the to industry as a whole. They would find a lot of problems with this because it says a whole bunch of things. For instance, no institution to establish secret, ... And they would argue, whether valid or not, they would lobby against it very strongly. And again, these things are only meaningful if they can be internationalized. You know, we're seeing that in the European, I can never pronounce the abbreviations, but their latest privacy things, that it's difficult to see how you can ever internationalize that. It's just, you know, sort of action at a distance. If you have a player in some other country and you're going to insist that they observe European law, unlikely in practice. China is never going to do that. U.S. will never do it if they can get away with it. The only place you can get any meaningful thing is something that's acceptable to everybody, and that's hard.
And is this because of not only a conflict of quote-unquote values between making money and other concerns versus ethics and education, and also is it also because, I'm asking perhaps leading questions, but I'm asking you to comment, or is it also because potentially or not of different values in different parts of the world?
Well, it's both. Sorry. I mean, one thing I learned in being in Japan is that the value system is different. It doesn't show necessarily, but it's fundamentally different. Many of the European countries suffer from that. The U.S. is it has value system, but I haven't figured out exactly what it is. And it changes. Now, that's not to be criticized only. I mean, it's nice to have that diversity, but there is a problem if you're trying to say certain things are not reasonable. We've seen that even things which we thought were international, the Nuremberg conventions, the informal conventions, have been violated so often that it's not even funny. So I'm not sure how to handle it. The UN has not been very successful. ITU has tried, not very successfully. And first of all, the whole vehicle that this thing runs on is also a very political beast. The internet, its connectivity, blockades on it, all this have national implications in many countries and are very difficult to get any agreement on. I could have a whole lecture on, in fact, I'm going to have a whole lecture when I get back in Taiwan on the behavior of certain countries with respect to the international connectivity of the internet. Many of them are blockading, attempted blockade. Yes, sir.
Just a minute, we have a question up here.
Okay, and then how much time do we have? Okay.
This is going to be short. So Vince's famous for saying IP over everything. Obviously, that's a viral concept, and that we have to deal with it. I think you're owning up to that. I like that. That's great. So IP over everything being a viral concept that took over, that lacked any sort of form of control that we've had to layer on that would have been existing in other protocols that look to be post-internet protocol. Is it possible, just looking at it from a systems perspective, that humans are actually hardwired to self-destruct, and the nuclear thing is just like what you see in Star Wars?
I'm not sure I caught that completely. The echo in here is a little tricky. Can you just cut the question a little bit?
Sure. So technologically, I think the idea of this talk is that we need to have diffused knowledge between engineers and ethicists, and that conversation has been lacking, and that by diffusing that knowledge, that's going to address that in the right forum, of which ACM, perhaps EPIC, EFF are not the right fora, or international political fora. But it's possible, I know within IEEE that we wrote some papers that would introduce IEEE members to ethics, and that IEEE members also have an ethical obligation when they design systems. So shouldn't every engineer take into account ethics?
Yeah. I mean, every society, every engineering society has had those type of statements in the past. IEEE is certainly one. I think the ACM has one. I could probably count on several hands the number of IEEE or ACM members who have ever read it, more or less obeyed it. There's also a problem that, again, you have this conflict between the ethical situation and the fact that you work for a company who expects you to do things. And if you blow whistles too often, you suddenly find you're unemployed. More or less the fact that I know of no class in engineering that actually goes over the IEEE ethics, or the mechanical engineers or chemical engineers ethical statement. So there's a problem there, whole set of problems. Probably the only way I can see out of that, and I'm not sure I like this, is to hold companies legally liable. Okay, we've created an environment now which I support, in the sense that companies like Google are not responsible for the information they handle. I could give a 2-hour talk on the problems we've had with social networks and false news. By the way, that's not a new occurrence. It's been around for a long, long time. realized that we started a war back in 18-something based on false news of a Chicago newspaper. So it's an old game. But I just derailed myself. But yeah, I think you know where I'm going.
Speaking of cross-pollination between science and liberal arts and business, when I think of the internet and computers, I, of course, relate to Amazon, Google, Facebook, and the rest. My question to you is, these three companies in particular have grown almost like horrendous Godzillas to have become global entities taking over our lives almost. Would, as a certain not to be named political candidate has suggested, breaking up these monopolies solve any of the problems, since they have just grown so immensely, so fast, so quickly, and have taken over our lives almost? Would smaller entities be more open or be part of the solution to making ethics more,
Yeah. First of all, I think it's unlikely that under my understanding of current antitrust laws that you get away with declaring them to be bad. I mean, if you're going to use antitrust laws, you have to show some stuff. I'm not a lawyer, but it strikes me that there's a lot of competition there, and so isn't that what we want? I think the way you will attack that is to make them liable for certain things. Okay, now realize that that's a negative thing. I mean, they act as publishers, as innocent bystanders. They just relay stuff. I think that's going to get harder and harder to defend, and you'll probably find laws which make them liable for certain things. That will make them more careful. Whether that solves the problem, I don't know. Basically the reason they've grown is they supply a service for nothing. In return, you give them access to all your data. The public can easily get around that. There are a lot of competitors out there who'll be happy to supply a service where you pay it by the month. And they will, quote, hands off. Those have never succeeded very well.
but the public is becoming more and more conscious of this and reacting and revolting against that. So you see no difference between size and ethics.
I didn't say that.
Oh, sorry.
I said it's most difficult.
Okay. Understood.
And size is certainly, control is certainly, when you control marketplace, you tend to get a little bit. I just don't see how that's going to happen. I would argue that the public, yes, is concerned. Will they be concerned enough to do anything in the ballot box? That's our mechanism. So far, they haven't seemed to be that worried about it. I worry a lot about it, but I have a way out. Now, I use my Keio account, which Google is contractually not allowed to scan.
All right, thank you.
We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to make my way up front shortly.
Yeah, I need to sit for a few minutes. Is it okay if I come off the stage? Oh, bring me a chair would help.
Thank you for addressing these interesting issues. My question is, within the last 10 days, I saw 3 examples of how a machine or robot have been introduced in addition to, and I'm wondering about taking the jobs of people in the future. I'm wondering if our children are being prepared for the jobs in the future.
I would worry too. We keep talking about the reindustrialization of the U.S., at least our current president, and yet that translates into very few jobs. And the jobs are certainly not job replacement jobs. Thank you. Let me sit down for a minute. I'm not completely shocked, but my knee got affected by low benches in Japan. Their seats are low, and it's a problem. That's a big problem because, and if you look at Europe, there are solutions. For instance, in Germany, the BMW factories and most of the auto factories work, what, a four-day week max? And it's not 8 hours a day. And with courtesy of German, every week has a holiday in it. Very few people there, and but the workers are paid well, and I'm not sure exactly what happened to all the people who used to be in the assembly plant. Here, we just don't educate people. And in fact, I think we're going the wrong direction. There's an argument now that who needs a college education? High school is enough. No, that's nonsense. It's nonsense even for things which we might not enjoy. The military does not want high school graduates. They turn out to be not very competent in handling the weapon systems we have. And they will not be competent to handle the manufacturing systems we have, nor the computer systems we have. So yeah, it's a big problem. How to cure it is more of a complex issue. I mean, certainly, I have not thought that in detail. I know how I can do it at the university, but it has to be deeper. I will aside, Keio did a 4-part biography of me, which is sort of fun. It's on the Keio site, if anybody, keio.ac.jp. And one of the things I said in there is that one of the biggest influences on my career was the fact there was a company called Heathkit. How many remember? Okay. I learned electronics from assembling Heathkits. Besides how to put them together, there was a big section on how they worked, and that turned me on. We don't have that anymore. We have maybe a few small things, but you know, there's not been the effort to teach people or expose people to sort of how to deal with the simple things, the fundamental things. Maybe there are little computer chipsets, but they're very weak compared to Heathkits. So maybe we need to understand that we're going into an era where our population has to understand the technology, has to understand how to live and work in that technology, and we're not doing it.
All right, so given we have these concerns about the consequences of computer science being applied unethically, how much do you think going forward further ethical education towards computer science students and professionals in that field could be done to undo ethical mistakes? Or do you think that it's likely that any learning networks that are set up improperly are here to stay for quite a while, regardless of who ends up being put in charge of them in the future?
Well, I think you're asking two questions. One, the mess we created, and I admit to it. Remember, the internet was an experiment. Okay, we had no interest in making it secure or anything because it was an experiment. You know, they sort of got away from us. Happy it did, but on the other hand, it's architecturally unsecurable the way it is now. And there are millions and millions of machines out there, so it's a big problem, which we're thinking of addressing. It's a real indigestible problem. And what was the other part? Remind me.
I'm not sure if that's partially answered both parts.
Okay, then happy day.
Thank you.
Never complain with a satisfied customer.
Doctor, with the issue of cybersecurity and the fact that today we can turn off all the utilities with the computer, we can stop factories and potentially stop all vehicles with the new technology from being able to be operated. how do we as a country protect ourselves and our national interest by preventing this type of thing from being able to be accomplished by rogues?
Okay, that's a problem I've been thinking about for a long time. We know how to make a much, much more secure system. Okay, we don't see a way of retrofitting it to what's out there. So my personal approach to it is to take systems that are critical, that are real critical systems like power, financial, etc., and create much more secure environments in there. We know how to do it technically. Not perfect, but much better than it is now. And companies have tried that. I was involved in at least 3 attempts with Intel to do it. And in all cases, the market wasn't there. Okay, people were not interested in spending money. IBM used to say that they asked their customers, are you willing to spend 2% more for security? And the answer was no. After this set of things, I suspect if they ask again, they get back an answer, well, 20 or 30% would be willing if you could actually do it. And we are in a very dangerous situation. I could elaborate on that, but I think that would be outside this. We did at Stevens, I think, to a degree, because they can cause escalation. The problems are just, again, we did an experiment. And as most experiments, we never worried about whether people would use it. We were trying to solve a research problem. And it got away from us. And the same thing happened, well, it didn't happen with the bomb. And that was a more focused thing. But nobody thought about limiting it afterwards until it was sort of too late. I don't know how to sensitize people to that. A friend of mine who's, I think I'd call him a friend, he has a senior heading all the computing and information technology for a major New York bank. You know who it is. And he said the thing that keeps him awake at night is security. And I suspect the reason he stays awake at night is that they've been attacked successfully often. But we have a mess on our hands. And there's no way of patching it. Zero way. You're going to have to rip it all up and largely start again. And that would probably be a good idea anyway, because what we develop now doesn't work very well at the speeds we're working now or the speeds we can anticipate. But getting even the research, National Science Foundation to do things here is difficult. Because usually what happens is you talk about the next generation internet, what it turns out is some small increment on the way, all the research that's going on now to make sure that it continue to get funded. That's not what's needed. What's needed is a revolution, not an evolution. If you can figure out how to do that, let me know. I've tried.
Thank you. It would seem to me that the militaries of the world would be both the biggest drivers of this technology as well as the least controllable. So could you address that question?
Yeah, I'll give a short form. There are 2 problems there. Several years, 5, 6 years ago, there was a meeting at West Point. It's called the Senior Seminar, and it has nothing to do with seniors academically. And they look at future problems, and one of them was on cybercrime and cyber war. Very interesting session, but there was 2 things there that interest me. There was a person who was basically extremely senior in the military intelligence system, okay? Leave it at that. It was Chatham House rules. You're not allowed to say who said what. And basically, he opinioned that MilNet, the military net, had no such problems because there was an air gap between the civilian net and the military net, and they were secure, therefore. I pointed out to him that was the 3rd time they said that, and neither previous case had ever worked. The other one was a little thing, and I think it shows the level of understanding. A person who was president of a very, very secure aerospace company, extremely secure. You could probably figure out who. Worried about people bringing in flash drives into their offices, because those things are marvelous for bringing contagion in. And so he sent a letter out to everybody saying, under no conditions are you to do that. He then repeated it 2 weeks later. Then he took 100 flash drives and put in just the reporting stuff, just so they could see if they were plugged in, scattered them over the parking lot. 75% of them were brought in and plugged in. Of that 75% who were plugged in, 80-some-odd% were plugged in by senior management. His only suggestion was super glue in every USB connection. And that wouldn't work, I pointed out to him. There's a fundamental lack of understanding. And we see it, if password files appearing unencrypted. I think the way to cure that problem is to make them liable for it. Do you believe that the military has ever found itself ethically bound? I don't think I think the only time we've successfully did something, to my knowledge at least, was after Germany, after World War II. And we didn't really do that. We did it in Germany, not in Japan. I suspect that from all I can tell, they could do almost anything and get away with it. That's unfortunate, but it's the way international law and domestic law. We don't hold our military responsible, except in rare cases. Don't realize that after World War II, they were sprinkling biological stuff over San Francisco. They were exposing civilians to radioactive stuff with no attempt to think about the ethical implications. Yeah.
Dave, we have one final question. I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Okay.
My question essentially is, in an environment where computer systems can make decisions that could lead to the loss of human life, who do you think should be allowed to determine a kind of a permissible probability of failure? And by that I mean, should the company do it? Should we have a third party that determines this? Or alternatively, should we not even have any strict regulation? Because perhaps you could say, well, if it's dangerous, then people won't buy the product or buy into whatever system.
Well, we do that semi-successfully in medical area. And to put a medical device out is not a trivial exercise. To put software out that may have equally annoying byproducts like security issues, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't see anybody being prosecuted for doing it, false advertising or anything. I hate to say government. I think the only way I can think of that is effective is to allow people to sue, class action or whatever, and because the government will be very much impacted by political philosophy and lobbyists. And just the political world they live in. Even Europe can't do that, and believe me, in Asia it's even worse. So I think at least in the United States, where I vaguely know what the legal system is, if you allowed class action suits, you might be able to control them. In Europe, I'm not sure, and in Asia, the legal system escapes me completely. It's very interesting. I just stay out of the way of lawyers in Tokyo. No, I don't do that. They're actually good, but it's the Japanese legal system confuses me. So I thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the perfect start of what is sure to be a thought-provoking